Hi, yeah, I have a question for Dr. Terry. I was just wondering, I thought that was a really great presentation, and I was just wondering, like, what kind of warning signs would you be looking for in times like these? We talked about increase in danger of intimate partner violence. What should people be looking for as clues to that?
Great question.
So are you asking more, excuse me, specifically for clues that that's happening in the household, or like clues that kids are being exposed to that in the household?
I think either one, because, just from prior work experience, personal experience, it's not something that someone shows up in your office and usually tells you about.
Right.
So, I think we probably know some warning signs to look for generally, but do those carry through these specific times, or are there certain things we should be kind of clued into?
I'll give my educated guess on this, because I think since we've never experienced anything like this before, where the mass majority of people are trapped in their homes, to really maybe know what that would look like. But I would assume a lot of it remains the same. So if people are usually, if people are essential workers, for example, I've read plenty of news reports from different nonprofits and hotline numbers saying that people have called in saying things like, I am an essential worker and I need to go to work, but my significant other has said, I can't go to work. So they're controlling, even allowing, the person to leave for work. I've seen a lot about health related concerns. So they might think that they're actually sick. Maybe they even have a symptom related to the virus, but the controlling person's not allowing them to go to the doctor and telling them, if you do leave and you're possibly exposed to people, then you're not coming back here. So I'll just throw you out on the street. So I think some of that is similar to what we would see every day. So if family members know that a loved one's not being allowed to leave their home, or a loved one, even for a walk, right? We're not supposed to really be going anywhere, but if they are generally an essential worker and not allowed to go, if they're not allowed to seek medical treatment, but someone knows that they're ill, if someone's controlling their money or threatening, not to allow them access to their kids or their money because they go out and expose themselves to people. So I think to some degree, it probably looks a lot like it does during non-pandemic times. But I think it'll be harder for people to pinpoint because we are told to restrict our movement. So if you're in a home and you're supposed to be in your home, how do people really know what's happening? So I think that there's an additional barrier because we don't really know what's happening when you're encouraged to be at home and not to be present and out in the community. I think in terms of kids, I realize it's all for the greater good of keeping more people healthy. I think we have a lot of kids who are now in very unfortunate circumstances. And I have been working some with Megan Milner with Juvenile Services in the state. And she's been asking about intake differences for kids. So are we seeing an increase in juvenile intakes? And in the month of March, the numbers were lower. I haven't had a chance to run any analysis on it yet because I'm waiting for more information. But it seems like the numbers are lower, but I think maybe that's very short term. I think if we run this out and look at intake numbers in 6, 9 months, even a year, I think we're going to see an increase because it'll take that period of time for kids to be exposed to all of this additional violence and out in the communities doing things that we then pick them up for. As Kristen said, more law enforcement typically responds or are first responders to mental health. So I think law enforcement will be the first responders to the behaviors we see from kids who are then out in the communities. But I don't think we'll see that yet. That's just my sort of anecdotal guess is maybe within the next year, I think we'll see a spike. And I think I saw a comment come up that said we've already seen an increase in Garden City. So When I made this presentation, I didn't see as much of the police reporting out in Kansas, and now I've seen quite a bit saying lots of increases in domestic violence calls, which actually sort of surprises me because of the things that Kristen had said, that there are people who are willing to call. I'm sort of surprised that we see an increase. I'm not surprised that we see an increase in hotline calls, but I'm sort of surprised that we would have an increase in law enforcement calls. But I think that's a good thing that somebody's willing to call. But I don't know if that answered your question. It's sort of me guessing what I think, what I'm assuming might happen or is happening, because I've never lived through this sort of scenario before.
No, that was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question.
Janice, I see you have a couple of comments. Do you want to share those with the group?
Well, yeah, first I want to address a question to Jeff, actually. Jeff, so the program you described, which sounds pretty interesting to me, what kind of funding do you think it would take to deliver your program to Western Kansas? And secondly, what kind of music do you think would be available to pull this off out there?
Yes, thank you for that question. As I mentioned in my talk, that we provide for our Manhattan program scholarship funding that's provided through Yes Scholarship Fund and the Greater Manhattan Community Foundation. In FY19, we provided a little over $13,000 in scholarship for about 120 students. Now that not 120 students total. So a portion of those received that $13,000. In terms of funding for the satellite programs, the community foundation and through other funds, the funds that we have through the community school, we're committed to providing that same level of scholarship at that 60% and 35% for students who qualify for free and reduced lunch. The shortfall, that 40% versus 65%, is going to vary per families, and a lot of families may need 100% scholarship tuition, depending upon what their needs are. So that's one piece of funding. In terms of the cost of tuition for a 10-week or 10-lesson semester, we would be talking about a total tuition of about $500 per student. So, if you look at 60% of that, then, we would need another $200 if a student needed the 100% tuition per student. And then, that's what provides the compensation for the instructor in the program. The piece of travel funding that I mentioned would depend partly on the location, but we're kind of estimating that for the undergraduate team and for the instructors, that would be probably around $3,000 total for that to occur. And the instructor, obviously, as I mentioned in my talk, would be 5 times that instructor going to that location to provide the in-person instruction, and then the off weeks, that remote instruction. And this the COVID-19 situation has actually allowed us to experiment a lot with what remote instruction looks like in private lessons. And so a lot of students, or a lot of teachers, are using kind of a flip lesson format where the students are recording their performance and then providing that on a site. And then that remote lesson time is the teacher and the student reviewing that lesson and giving feedback. Because one of the things that we noticed in terms of sound quality is using a mechanism like Zoom. There's a lot left to be desired in terms of that. So we get a lot better feel for if a student can submit a recording, and then that lesson time is spent in reviewing that, kind of, like I said, in a flipped lesson format. So that's would minimize the time that teachers would have to come out. So they'd be coming out that 5 times to kind of keep a gauge on that. In terms of the research team, a lot of this is us to be able to develop how the best practices in setting up these satellite programs and learning from it. So the first piece is finding a place where the students and the lessons can occur, whether that's at a school or at a Boys and Girls Club or where students are, and making sure that this site team can look at that place and say, okay, this is a good location to do private lessons. It's relatively quiet. There's, if it's piano lessons, there's a piano. What does that look like in that environment? So that would be where the funding for that research team would be. In terms of what kinds of lessons, right now this is geared toward, even though community school offers instruction throughout the performing arts, in this kind of environment for this pilot setting, it makes sense to focus on private music lessons, because then you only have one teacher and it's a one-on-one instruction, and it's easier to gauge in that. But part of the needs assessment is where are there other needs for the community, or what are students looking for? So if there is a dance class or a theater class that there's an interest, then that would be something we could look into for the pilot. And part of it also is identifying the teacher. I mentioned we have about 30 instructors right now, some of which are K-State faculty or graduate students. And so gauging that timing would be a piece of this. But a lot of it is the site and what we can do there. And then also in terms of availability of instruments. If the student is, if it's a voice situation, is there a piano available? If it is a woodwind or string instrument or percussion instrument or brass, is there a way for the student to have access to an instrument so they can practice, so they can do that on the lessons, do those recordings? And that would require us to reach out to local areas or provide K-State instruments and what that looks like. So, a lot of it is going to be based on that survey about what the needs are, and then connecting our instructors to that.
Thanks a lot, Jeff. Any thoughts or responses to that? Comments?
If I can interject just one other thing to piggyback on that, Jeff. One of the things that Jeff and I have been looking for are some other streams of money. So we've written, Jeff has written proposals, and I said, that looks great. So Jeff has done the biggest part of that work. But we are looking for other funding streams that would give us a little cushion that would help supplement the funding for students who need that. So we're continuing to look. And we would work with the districts to try to supplement that in any way we can.
I noticed that Kathy wants to make a comment or ask a question.
I just wanted to ask Jeff if you are familiar with Bonnie Cameron in Hoxie and her program, her Main Street Theater program, summer program.
I don't know Bonnie, no.
Oh, you're going to really get into this. I'll get your email and send you a link to the Dane G. Hansen Foundation. I'm sure you're aware of the Dane G. Hansen Foundation. I believe that they've been big on this because they put an article in their fall 2019 Northwest Kansas Today magazine. Are you familiar with that?
No, I'm not.
Oh, it's an outstanding magazine. It's quarterly, and Dane G. Hansen Foundation publishes it with Aaron Matthews as the chief writer, and it is awesome. But the kids here in Atwood, I'm here in Atwood, and we have a number of kids who for several years have participated in this drama program. It's a whole area-wide drama program. And I live a block from the high school. I went up to see their Beauty and the Beast musical that they put on. And with the grant help, they've had the most fabulous costumes and singers and presentation and staging that I've ever seen in a student production in this whole area in the 40-odd years I've lived here. It was fabulous. And she is an amazing person who apparently is an opera singer who performed in Europe and has brought her talents to Hoxie. Her name is Bonnie Cameron, and I think she might be a really excellent contact to see what they're doing with their program and how maybe you might collaborate.
That's great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
You know, one of the things I'm thinking about as I sit here, I don't know how many you know this, but when they were doing the depression area WPA programs and all that stuff, they also had an arts outreach program that included photography, painting, drama, and they took all of that into rural communities. My aunt went around helping small communities during that period direct plays and things. So this is a wonderful concept. I hope we're able to keep bringing it forward.
Well, thank you so much. You know, one of the motivations in trying to branch out into satellite programs is we have a donor who taught violin. She now lives in Arizona, and she funds a string scholarship and a piano scholarship for us. But she taught violin at Clay Center, and so I shared with her that we had started this community school, and it was growing in Manhattan. And she said, "Well, when are you going to Clay Center? Because they need someone there." And it spurred the idea that there are a lot of underserved communities because it's not large enough to attract a string teacher or a piano teacher. And so if we can the vision kind of enveloped of having this Manhattan be the hub with spokes and satellite programs kind of throughout the state to be able to send teachers or to coordinate with many of our alumni who teach in the western part of the state to be able to work with our within our program and connect our alumni and our current instructors to these underserved communities.
Okay. Do we have other questions? If not, I'm looking. I see something from April.
I had a question for Kristen, so I hope I don't put you on the spot. But I've always wondered this, but never have taken the time to research it. So when you bring up remote healthcare, do you know what studies show about, I don't know, any sort of differences, like if people who participate in telemedicine are just as pleased with it, or if kids in particular aren't benefiting from it as much? I mean, I would agree with your comment that it just isn't the same, but I've never taken the time to read what other people are writing on it, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that question. I will look that up while other people, now I'm going to go look that up.
I need to look it up.
I know, with regards to like remote learning, and the outcomes are somewhat lower. So I don't know what that looks like for like, especially when it comes to like telebehavioral health. That's what I would be interested in knowing. So I'll look that up, and by the end of the Q&A, I'll have a better answer for you.
Okay, thank you. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but it was something I've just been too lazy to look up and should know.
Yeah.
You know, a number of years ago, I was at a national conference, and some people from Missouri, from a substance abuse treatment program for teens, presented because they did a unique follow-up program. And their follow-up program consisted of having the teens create avatars. They had a private platform for this. They created avatars, and the counselors were avatars, and they were doing all of their follow-up work with that. And they were finding, because of this medium, that they were getting above an 80% continuing rate for their students doing that. So one of the things I've been wondering about is, are we thinking about what ways in which young people interact over social media and telehealth, and are we adjusting to provide that in a way that they resonate with, rather than, you know, a traditional telehealth thing where the therapist is just talking to them over Zoom or whatever. So that was really interesting. They did really well with it. I don't know what other kinds of programs are happening. Janice, you're muted.
Thank you for getting me back on board. Sue, this is right to you. So when looking specifically at juvenile justice, involved youth, as in the case, one of the issues in this whole program, you explain some general research about the effects of mentoring. And if it's not directly impacting youth and reducing offending, lessening the risk level, et cetera, to what purpose or to what mentoring program do we turn that is evidence-based here in Western and rural Kansas?
Yeah, good question. As I started researching this, it is complicated. There's no doubt about that. But there are some good sort of blue ribbon programs out there that check more boxes. In other words, in assessment, there are certain things that a program looks for in terms of validity, its application, how it's been demonstrated to be successful in various communities and places and times. So there's a whole long checklist, and the more checks that are on that list, the more effective the program is. So I can't necessarily, with time I could, but I don't recall the name of one, and that wouldn't be necessarily meaningful to anyone here. But there are a few that have proven to be successful in various ways. But it's that expectation that it's going to magically reduce recidivism that seems to be the sticking point. So there are other advantages, though, which may indeed produce indirect effects. So, for example, it increases competency with social skills, interaction, feelings of belonging, that sort of thing. It certainly increases confidence in many cases. It connects, obviously, that the youth to a strong influence in their lives. So all of those things are positive. It's character building and that sort of thing. But it's when you say, okay, I'm going to have a mentoring program over here. Now let's compare that with recidivism rates, that most of them fall short in having any kind of connection between those two. What most experts seem to be suggesting and recommending is that you combine mentoring with other programs that do hopefully and characteristically historically reduce recidivism. They're also really strongly recommended for reentry when a kid is taken out of the home or out of the community for any reason. Then mentoring seems to be that bridge that helps reintegrate a youth back into the community or even back into the home. So it's not, I don't want to give the impression that they're not successful at all, but they do come with a cautionary tale that you need to know what do you expect out of this mentoring relationship. Another recommendation is that there is ongoing training, not a one-shot training session, but that there's training throughout the mentoring relationship with both the mentor and the mentee. So those are some of the big things that people are, the experts are recommending that we consider when we start a mentoring program. And we are looking, that's really interesting and sought after aspect right now, not only in Kansas, but across the nation. So we do have some areas that are looking for that, and I'll be glad to work with anyone who wants to identify some evidence-based programs that do check a lot of those boxes in terms of effectiveness.
I'm wondering if Anne wants to add anything because she sent a comment that was pretty interesting. Anne?
So, Sue, I'm always so excited how our worlds overlap, but about 6 years ago, we ran into this same exact question and kind of how do we reconnect youth, specifically around reentry. And we borrowed from Dr. Roger Giorgiro out of, I think he was at University of Indianapolis. So we borrowed his model and now he's at AIM. But came out and trained us. So the short story of it is that we utilized university students to implement mentoring, which was just really an incredible outcomes is what we've seen. Oops. The reason is students have a flexibility that so at the time when we implemented it, we used a kind of a traditional, well-known mentoring, adult mentoring model, and we matched them to youth coming out of detention facilities. At the same time, we used students. And what we found is the adults didn't have the same tolerance for kind of adolescent shenanigans and / delinquent behavior. Like there was a little bit of frustration that the mentors experienced. But students really rode out the storm with these youth. Now I'll send you a bunch of information on this because we've really gone through a transformation and we've changed the mentoring model. But to your point, we were so disappointed that we did not move the mark on recidivism. We've done years and years of work and research, and recidivism, our youth actually, our students have gained a lot, but the youth that were matched went back to facilities at a higher rate than the youth that weren't matched. So we're kind of back to
shake our heads at that. Yeah, it's really complicated, and so you need to be really clear about your expectations going in. Yeah, I would love to get that information from you, Anne. Thank you.
I'll send it right away.
Fantastic.
So do we have more questions or comments for any of our speakers? I'm looking here.
I do. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yay. Kristen, okay. You mentioned that when you talked about rural Kansas issues relative to mental health, you talked about the need to be accessible and that one size fits all won't work. So I'm wondering, do you think that's true of all service providers, actually clinical, I'm a clinical social worker across the line, different areas of the practice. And also, are there any good models out there to change that one size fits all?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with just being, having good cultural competence. And, even within rural communities, each community is distinct. So I think part of it is for the provider kind of being aware of what's the unique culture of that community. And a lot of it for rural areas is being able to establish those relationships. Relationships is really key, and people who are familiar with the community are going to have better luck in connecting with individuals than people who don't have connection with them. So I think I don't know if I wouldn't say there's one necessarily good model. And I think this covers across, providing services. So it's not just behavioral care, but behavioral mental health, but also primary health care, even school resources, being able to connect with individuals and form those relationships. And being a member of the community is going to go a long way than if you're kind of an outsider in the community. Last week when Travis and I were talking about the grant application that we have, one of the things that I thought was unique is that we were really focused on providing training for providers who were already in the area. So we were, rather than bringing in a new mental health therapist, we were training school staff to lead these peer support groups because they're already in the community. They know the kids. They already have that trust built, and having that pre-existing relationship is going to go a long way, especially in rural areas. But I think just knowing the community and being able to adapt to each unique community, regardless of if it's an urban or rural area, is really what's most important.
Okay, thank you. What about other either questions or comments?
And can I go back? Sorry, can I go back to April's question? Because I promised to return with an answer. So it's interesting. So April's question was related to the outcomes of effectiveness for tele-behavioral healthcare. And the interesting thing is in the evidence that I have quickly been reading in these past 5 minutes, is that some of the outcomes are actually similar to in-person care, that for people with, who are receiving behavioral telemedicine for anxiety or depression, is that the assessment and treatment outcomes are similar, but there is some potential for patients to kind of report reduced comfort with the services, but you can still kind of have this same therapeutic relationship if you're kind of utilizing these best practices. I think it also helps if they already have that pre-existing relationship, that if you start on telehealth, you might not have as great of outcomes as if you've kind of met once or twice in person and then kind of added in some telebehavioral health to kind of provide additional services.
Thank you.
Any other thoughts or comments? I have a kind of question or wondering for Sue and Ann, I think, about these mentoring programs. One of the things that I've always worried about mentoring programs, having worked with a lot of kids in my life, is that mentors are in and out of their life, particularly if you use university students. There's a lot of in and out. And is anybody taking a look at how that impacts the kids? Because I think that could have the result that you were talking about, that the person leaves their life, there's yet another loss, and then maybe they do something bad and end back up in the system.
Yeah, and I'll let you take that one.
Okay, I was going to say, we look at this specifically. In fact, when we recruit students, they have to come in for an interview and they have to commit to a full year, and they take a 2-semester course. So the other reason students work well, to be totally honest, is because they're doing this for a grade. And so there's an incentive not to back out or run away. In about 200 matches, we've had 2 students, I believe, drop the class or, So there's kind of this extra incentive and a requirement for continuing to meet even when things get tough or when the kid's on run. The student is working very hard to keep that match going. Now, at the end in May, when students graduate, we have to make a choice about whether or not they'll continue the match, usually electronically. And most students want to continue the match. And then what happens is about 4 months later, it wanes, right? Like the student graduates and life changes. So we're really working with that piece of the puzzle, because the matches that have sustained, and I'll send Sue, we have a really outstanding case that they've been meeting since 2015. They've been matched. So students are willing generally to keep that relationship open. The other thing is sometimes we close matches and then 3 years later, the youth will reach out to the student, sometimes in the middle of the night, and say, hey, I need your help. So it's really interesting with students because there's a different dynamic, right? They need a grade from the class, but also they want recommendations and things. So they are pretty committed to following through with the youth. And I think they're idealistic, right? Like they want to help improve the life of a young person. Sometimes they're more excited than the professionals we're working with, to be totally honest. So,
but they still leave, is my point. Even if they've had a good relationship, they still leave at some point. Now, all of us have those kinds of relationships, but I'm wondering what the impact is on kids who are already in difficult circumstances or would not need that mentor.
Yes. Yeah.
This reminds me a little bit, for 20 years, I've been matching my students with incarcerated individuals in projects, and they become pen pals, and then they tour and they meet face to face. And many of those, and so this is just for a semester, but many of them do go on to long-term, sort of relationships, partnerships, in which they stay in contact, sometimes for years and years after that. So a couple of things. First of all, right up front, we talk quite openly with the inmates about expectations, so that we don't set an expectation too high, that this is going to be a lifelong friend for them. We have a realistic view of it. So I think that might be important as well, to have those expectations right up front. And secondly, the ones that do last for months or years after that, talk about how important it is to just maintain any kind of connection, even though it may seem tenuous or slight at the time. And they come up with these incredible stories. One of Anne's comments reminded me of one that said, absolutely, the inmate saved my life because they were having a family crisis and they had a sister that was suicidal and some things like that. And the inmate was able to give her insight and said, never, never give up. I'll go right there. And she went to see the sister, and sure enough, it was a happy ending and that sort of thing. So I think those two things are important. We never quite know how deep that time might be and how lasting, even though they may not have regular contact. And secondly, probably most important, is be really honest and open about those expectations on both sides right from the get-go.